So let's talk about RSpec Rails and try to do a somewhat realistic example. And also learn about this red-green refactor cycle. We already talked about the red part and the green part, and we'll talk separately about the refactor part. But this is sort of the essence of test-first development. You think of one thing that the code should do that it doesn't do now. Right? So you're developing a new feature. There's one behavior of the code, and you need to start writing that one behavior. So first, capture that thought in a test. This turns out to be really important for a reason that not only is not obvious from this slide, but won't be obvious to you until you've done this several times, which is if you have a piece of code that you're trying to develop, and it's got to do 6 different things, if you first write the code and then you try to test it, you're likely to find that testing each of those 6 things in isolation is exceedingly awkward and painful, and your reaction will be, why testing? My code works. Let's just move on. However, if you write a test for each of the behaviors, and as you complete each test, you write just enough code to do that one behavior, then maybe after the second or third one, you'll realize that getting all 6 behaviors into one piece of code is difficult. You'll refactor your code, which probably will make your code better, and you'll end up with a testable piece of code. It's supposed to do 6 things, and you've got 6 different tests, each of which exercises one of the things without tangling them all together. So it's a non-obvious benefit that you have to do this a few times to really realize, which is why the advice is to write the simplest possible code that lets the test pass. Yes, you've got 6 features that this code has to do, but get the first behavior right, and then move on to the other behaviors. Once you've done that, you can look for commonality with other tests, so you can dry out your tests, essentially. You can also look at places where your code could be cleaned up. If you've been sort of adding on to your code for each of those 6 features, you may get to a point where you realize that your code actually could be cleaned up quite a bit and still be passing those tests independently. So that's the refactor step. And then you continue on with the next thing. And eventually you get to where you have written enough new code that you pass a cucumber step, and that's kind of our unit of doing work, right? Our unit of customer satisfaction is the user story, and within a user story, the steps in the scenario are the unit of getting behaviors in that feature to work. So the idea here is that you always have working code, right? As soon as you have a piece of code and a corresponding test that work together, the next thing you're going to do is write a test that immediately fails because it exercises code you don't yet have. And you should think of your goal as you're like a rubber band, right? You're getting away from the state where you have green tests covering your code. You temporarily have red because you either are creating a test for code that doesn't exist yet, or you're making some change that's necessary to your existing code to accommodate that next behavior. But your goal is minimize the time spent in the red state. Get back to the green state as soon as possible. And the smaller each individual change is that's well supported by your tests, the easier it is to get back quickly to that green state, right? Green is good. Okay, so preview of RSpec Rails. In the homework assignments, you already saw a sort of very general version of how specs are written when what you're testing is plain old Ruby code. You can make expectations about individual objects. Now, when you're doing software as a service, there's a lot of other behaviors that are inherent to how your app works that you'd like to test. So, for example, we would like to exercise controllers. When you write a controller action, does that controller action have the correct behaviors? Now, remember when you stimulate a controller action in your real app, there's the app server that gets in front of your app, there's the routes file that gets parsed, there's all of this machinery that happens before your controller app ever gets called. And the side effect of that is that there's an environment inside of which your controller action runs. So when you test your controller action, ideally you want to test it under those same conditions. So RSpec Rails is a gem that adds a number of behaviors to RSpec that essentially allow you to mimic the conditions under which different parts of your Rails app would be exercised without having to fire up the entire app. So for example, in the case of testing a controller, RSpec Rails adds new actions to RSpec like get and post and put that simulate what would happen if a browser really did that. In other words, the routes are looked up correctly, params are parsed correctly, all of the same things as if that action was going to be really called in your live application, but without you having to fire up the entire application to do it as Cucumber would do. You also care about things like when the controller finishes doing whatever it did, the next step in Model View Controller is something has to be rendered. Or, as we saw in the HangPerson app, maybe you redirect and you have another action take care of that. But at any rate, the thing that the controller does when it finishes is one of the things you might want to test. So if the controller was supposed to redirect under certain circumstances, how do you know if it actually did that? If the controller is supposed to render a particular view, how can you check whether it chose the right one to render? And if the controller is supposed to set up some variables so that the view can render those variables, how can you make sure that the controller set up those variables properly? So all of those things are testable using some of the extensions that RSpec Rails adds onto the core RSpec functionality. So in the parlance that we've been using so far, those things are matchers, right? Remember that an expectation, or an example of an expectation that we saw, is just using the RSpec keyword expect, and you pass it either a piece of code to run or an object to look at. And then there's the part that comes after to, right? Expect object to have some property. That second part is the matcher, and one of the biggest components of RSpec Rails is additional matchers. So for example, as we'll see as I build up an example line by line, one of the things that you can say about a controller action is that the response given by the controller will end up rendering a certain template. Now, if you were using Cucumber, the template would actually get rendered, but remember that part of what we're trying to do is test different parts of the app in isolation, right? That's the difference between unit or functional testing on the one hand and integration or full stack testing on the other hand. So when RSpec says that you expect the controller's response to render a certain template, all it's checking is whether the app, if it was running in a live environment, has set up the world so that the next thing that happens is rendering that view, or so that the next thing that happens is sending a redirect back to the user's web browser. And as we'll see, there's also support in RSpec Rails for creating various doubles that are needed when you test a non-toy method. What do I mean by a non-toy method? It's very common, I think, when you start learning about unit tests to look at functions like the square root function. And writing a unit test for square root conceptually is pretty easy, right? It's a function, so it gets an input, it produces an output, and the unit test is essentially checking various critical values to make sure they work. In any non-toy function, the function is going to depend on other functions, probably in other classes. So the fundamental problem that we're always dealing with when we try to do fine-grained testing is if I'm trying to test object X, or let's say specifically method M in object X, and that method relies on methods from other classes, I don't want my test to depend on the implementation of those other classes, right? That's the fundamental problem we're going to try to solve. So the example that we're going to work through to show how we think about solving that problem comes from the book, and it comes from this gem that really exists, which, by the way, I submitted a pull request last week, which got accepted, and now it has the correct error behavior when your API key doesn't work. This is a gem called TMDB, which provides a nice Ruby-wrapped API to essentially an open source version of something like IMDb. And the book goes through this process of adding a new feature to Rotten Potatoes, where instead of typing in the information about a new movie on that form, you can just search for it in this open movie database. And if it exists, you can just populate it that way. So the Cucumber scenario has this step that after I fill in the search terms for a movie and I press the Search TMDB button, in the real app, what that is supposed to do is cause my app to call the TMDB API, and if the movie is found, to populate the Rotten Potatoes database with that information. So if you recall, when we said adding a new feature means you need a new route, new controller action, and a new view, this part is really about when you press the search button, what's the next thing that happens? Well, from your app's point of view, the controller action is the point of entry, right? So if we're going to develop new code to make this red step pass, that code, the first thing we're going to have to think about is, okay, what happens when that controller action gets invoked? And how do we test the behaviors of that controller action in isolation from all of the things that in real life the controller action would depend on? Okay, so that's where we're going with this. Again, before we go there, let's take a sanity check to make sure we're on the same page about what the real life code would do. So somewhere we're expecting that we're going to have a method in our app, Rotten Potatoes, that contacts TMDB to do a search for a movie. Is that method going to be a class method of our movie model, an instance method of the movie model, a controller method, or a helper method? Which of these four things is the method that contacts TMDB likely to be?